Okay. Okay, so here I am in Vancouver's downtown east side. This has been ground zero for the drug war for 100 years.
Gotcha.
And I am here with Neil Magnusson. Neil here is one of the OG cannabis activists fighting prohibition for decades now.
Yep.
And he's going to tell us a little bit about the Cannabis Substitution Project. But first, can you tell us a bit about your background and how you got involved with cannabis activism in the first place?
So yeah, I kind of grew up in East Van, started smoking cigarettes around 10. My parents moved us out to Surrey when I was 12 years old. By 15 I was smoking cannabis, drinking alcohol, doing all kinds of different drugs. But when I came out of that, by the time I was in my early 20s, I was just using cannabis. That was it. It was kind of my substance of choice. And I went on to get married, live in the mainstream, be a carpenter, an insurance restoration guy, and use cannabis. And my son, when he turned 16, he wanted to smoke a joint with his dad. And that was not a good bonding moment to father and son, like having a beer. That was me thinking, well, now my son's going to be involved in illegal activity, and he's going to have to worry about the cops like I have for my whole life, and this really sucks. And very synchronistically around that time, there was a poster on a telephone pole about a protest against the cannabis laws, and we went to that in 1999. And so we went to all the different protests for the next 5 years, my son and I. Cannabis Day, the Global Marijuana March, different protests and things, and became quite active as volunteers in putting on of these things. And 5 years into that, the fellow that had been putting it on for all those years, he approached me, asked me if I'd help him in a dispensary, really. We called it the Herb School. And so that next long weekend, I went to him to help renovate the space. And during the long weekend, I learned all about the prohibition of cannabis and who's behind all of that and who it's protecting and why it's there. And I became very disillusioned with our world because of that. And by the end of that long weekend, I was in tears, quitting my job, deciding that I had to do something to try to end what was going on with cannabis prohibition, and moved right into that place. It became my home for a couple of years. It was a center of activism. It was just one block over there at Main and Hastings. And it was during that time that I learned that people that were involved with hard drug use, because this is the area for it, and this is the area we had to place because that's what was offered to us at cheap rent. The fellow that became my business partner, the guy that was putting on those pot rallies. And so we were David Malmo Levine.
Okay.
And so we were right in the heart of where the hard drugs were being sold. And within a short period of time, many of the people that were accessing cannabis through us were the hard drug users. And we had a woman named Lady Marijuana who provided edibles for us, brownies and cake. And people were telling us that a couple of good strong brownies, they could get right through the night with all the other drugs. And then after a longer period of time, many people were people that we'd come to know that were now only using cannabis, that had used the edibles to get through withdrawal. And that was very powerful. That was back in like 2004. So now you fast forward ahead to another crisis of overdose because of a poison drug supply with the hard drugs, with the opioids and things. And the government at the time, in trying to address the 180 plus dispensaries that were working in Vancouver offering cannabis to people, they wanted to license those dispensaries, but really they wanted to reduce their numbers greatly. Mm-hmm. And they took away several revenue streams, including edibles. And so at that same time, the crisis is hitting with the opioids. The government's trying to take away the availability of edibles. And I was like, that's the last thing to do. What you need to do is have edibles easily available to people. Mm-hmm. And I tried to get the government on board with that. I ended up just getting donations from dispensaries and handing them out myself. And that became the Cannabis Substitution Program. That's over 5.5 years ago now. For the first year, we did that once a week. We handed out care packs of 4 to 6 edibles and a couple of joints to the hundreds of people that would line up around the block to get them. We then moved for the next 2.5 years. We did it twice a week. Every Thursday and Sunday we were there. Same lineup of hundreds of people getting their care packs. And then, because the government municipally had passed a motion to support what we were doing, and we met with them and understood that we would find a storefront and move our project indoors. In good faith, we did that just right there. but city licensing wasn't familiar with that motion. They didn't care anyway. They said that before the city would license us, we would have to get, they said, the provincial government, but it turns out that it would be the federal government. So
okay. Let me just I want to set the scene a little bit, because some of our viewers are in the U.S. or other English-speaking countries. Vancouver for 100 years has been the center of the drug war. This neighborhood in particular.
Can
you speak a little bit about the history of the drug war from the beginning?
Well, the beginning would be, I guess, when Gassy Jack realized that there was going to be a road built between the capital of New Westminster and Vancouver, and he took his kegs of whiskey and his little Indian bride and his stepmother, and he canoed around to the place just a couple blocks down here, and he set up he went to the mill and he said, "Hey boys, I got myself some whiskey. I'm willing to sell you guys whiskey, and if you'll just help me build a little place to do that." And literally at the end of that day, they took lumber, and overnight they built a shack for him to sell whiskey out of, and that was Gassy Jack, the guy who Gastown is named after. So really, Vancouver was founded by a drug dealer, an alcohol salesman named Gassy Jack. Over the course of time, Vancouver built up. They had more and more people coming in, groups coming in and logging. It was mostly a logging center. And they were employing Asian people, Chinese people, to do a lot of the heavy manual labor that was going on around here. And so there was some pushback against that. And the Women's Anti-Immigration League held a rally outside of the main mill and got the workers at the mill all riled up about these Asian people coming here and taking jobs away from them. And they literally, at the lunch break, rioted against what is Chinatown, and they broke up storefronts, and they broke people's arms and punched people out, and that resulted in an inquiry coming from Ottawa into what happened, why there was an anti-Asian riot in Vancouver. And the Deputy Prime Minister at the time came here, William Lyon Mackenzie King, and he had an inquiry into what was going on. And in that inquiry, he found out that there were opium dens of this smoked opium that was being used by these migrant workers to deal with their pain. Yeah. And there was some white people that were also using those opium dens, and that was appalling to him. And he went back to Ottawa and put together the first ever federal laws in the country against plant medicine, and the Chinese version of smoked opium became illegal based on that, as a result of that riot against the Chinese people.
And the irony, of course, is that it was the British that got the Chinese addicted
in
to
the first
opium
place.
in the first place.
That's right, yeah. By dumping boatloads of opium into the Chinese culture there.
Yeah, so opium, heroin, cannabis.
Well, heroin came later.
None of this was illegal at that time, right?
It wasn't illegal, not illegal. The first time it was illegal was when in Canada was when the federal government made that one version of opium. They still used opium in lots of medical formations that were available in the botanical drugstores. Yeah. But that particular type of opium that they were smoking became outlawed. It was a few years later that cocaine was included in that, and then that was 1916. And then in 1923, based on a bunch of hype built up by Maclean's magazine, they outlawed cannabis. Maclean's magazine wrote an article, excerpts from a book called The Black Candle, written by Emily Murphy. She was a suffragette. She was a judge in Canada. And so she wrote this very...
The feminists are not all good guys in the history of Canada. You know, some of them were abhorrent racists and,
for sure,
prohibitionists.
Yep, the Victorian era produced a lot of very angry people.
Sexually frustrated.
Sexually frustrated, angry people, both male and female. So yeah, she did a lot of damage in that book, and she had the one chapter in there called Marijuana, the New Menace, and Maclean's magazine produced that excerpt in their magazine in 1922 in May, and you go down to 1923 in January, the hype that was built up by that article in that magazine about this crazy new drug from Mexico coming up that's going to affect our youth, it's going to make
you a mass murderer.
Yeah, violent and insane and die a horrible death. And based on all that hype, without any debate whatsoever, the Canadian Parliament made cannabis illegal in January. A minister named Bellin.
And something parallel was happening in the U.S. Around that time, or did it come later?
It came later in the U.S. It was actually in the 1930s that they came up with the Marijuana Tax Stamp Act in 1931, and that was where they said that you would have to get a government-issued stamp to be able to produce cannabis commercially.
The beginning of the licensing system.
Yeah, and the trick was that they didn't have any of those licenses. So when the farmers who'd been growing cannabis, and that was their main staple crop, went to the government office to get the stamp that was now required, the government office would say, well, we haven't got our shipment of stamps yet. We're really sorry about that. Nothing we can do except for help you out with putting in cotton or putting in some other crop. So they helped them by subsidizing other crops in place of cannabis, and literally within a year, they had wiped out the production.
Well, there's a reason that I wanted to talk about the States, because I think the drug war and racism have been intertwined since the very beginning, and that there was part of the whole reefer madness thing was the idea that white women would go to jazz clubs and wind up sleeping with black musicians.
Because they were affected by smoking reefer.
Yeah. They could never want to sleep with black jazz musicians for any other reason than their cognitive impairment.
That's right.
This is the racist logic of the people of that time.
And William Randolph Hearst, with his newspaper empire right across North America in all the major cities, with his angst against the Mexicans for reclaiming a lot of land that he owned, he started writing, the stories that he was reporting on where there was violence, he would include in there that someone had seen the perpetrator smoking some reefer before they killed their parents. And it just became part of so many stories of violence. There's a huge coffee table book about Ye Tick that speaks to all those different stories that he wrote. And back in those days,
this whole chemical company too, right? The way that I think about it is also in relation to the forestry industry, because hemp could replace a lot of wood pulp, especially back in the day when newspapers were much more important to the informational landscape than they are now.
There was that as well, that they came up with the decorticator. So for all the time prior to that, throughout history, for millennia, the difficulty in removing the herd from the fiber of the stalk was the main barrier to using it effectively. You'd have to leave it out in the fields throughout the winter and let winter degrade it all down, and then you could thrash it and get the fibers off and get the herd out, and that's how that worked. So they came up with a machine called a decorticator that could do that easily, just run it through it and strip it all. And Popular Mechanics magazine in 1935 wrote an article. In fact, I was wrong about 1931. It was 1935 the tax stamp came out, and that year Popular Mechanics magazine had written an article about the decorticator, and on the front cover it said cannabis, or hemp, the first $1 billion crop in America. So that scared the cotton producers, that scared some other crop producers, forestry.
And the chemicals, because the
Dow Chemical Company, which was heavily involved, the Dow brothers.
Yeah, it's very chemical intensive to process wood pulp, so I think that this was one of the business interests that were threatened by, what you're saying, the decorticator, and this is something that I think that people miss a lot in talking about solutions to the problems of the world, is that if a solution happens to challenge somebody's business model, then they're going to suppress it,
For sure.
And
that's why we have these types of vehicles.
Yeah.
You have vehicles that you have to plug in. You have to either plug into gasoline or you have to plug into electricity. You got to have heavy-duty batteries to deal with the electricity that you're putting into those things. And that electricity all has to be created somewhere. It's not like batteries come creating energy. It's not how that works. But none of that has to be the case. That entire car body could be collecting solar energy.
Yeah.
They have solar collecting paint. It's easy. The wheels that are turning around could have oscillation in there, creating energy. just like we did when we were kids. You could have just a little thing that spins because of the tires, very precision turbines. You could have a channel of air running through cars that has turbines inside spinning. There's a whole bunch of ways, even braking, you can capture that energy.
Yeah.
So
if you can make more money by doing something,
you got fuel to sell.
Way, then
you're not going to let that car on the market.
No.
It doesn't need any fuel. You're selling fuel, and you got trillions of dollars. You got that much leverage. You can stop that technology from the marketplace.
Let's bring it back to the Cannabis Substitution Project, though. Basically, so we are in the midst of the opiate crisis. Opiate crisis has been getting worse for
several years now.
Several years. I mean, there is some positive developments in, do you want to, instead of my opinion, do you want to say what the good, bad, and the ugly of the drug war is right now?
There's very little good.
Yeah.
There's very little good. Governments are throwing a huge amount of taxpayer money into programs that don't help.
Yeah.
Into treatment centers that are ripping people off and not trying to get people better because they want people continuing to evolve through their programs. There's no options that are really viable. Everything is pharmaceutical based. So people that are on these drugs are yelling for a safe supply, and the government's like, okay, we'll give you safe opioids and other drugs that are just as deadly, except you're not poisoned with fentanyl. That's a safe supply.
Well, this is something that I feel strongly about, because I think that once you give the pharmaceutical companies the opportunity to make money off of the opiate crisis by providing drugs to the government, and the government's paying for them.
Taxpayers are paying for them. Government has no money.
Yeah, true.
We're paying for them.
Yeah. Then they have a vested interest in the problem continuing, and in fact, the problem getting worse.
That's right.
And so it goes back to the same sort of thing that we were talking about. Like, once you have somebody who's making money off of something, it becomes very hard to solve that problem.
Mm-hmm. And they give a lot of lip service to, here we're helping, we're spending money, but the money's not actually helping. The money's actually going to people that are corrupt, that are just feeding off of this whole situation. That's what's been going on. The bad thing is that they're not allowing for cannabis to be part of that equation. And the ugly thing is that they're actively trying to block us from providing cannabis as an option. The BPD have raided us. We've been charged with trafficking last May. We're still before the courts on that. And that is completely ludicrous. Upside down, backwards, inside out, this is the worst imaginable possibility, is that our government is so corrupt that we have a solution that we're not suggesting might work. We've been demonstrating it. We've been proving it every day now for the last 2 years on this block, but for 5.5 years, we've been demonstrating and proving that this works. We've got hundreds of people that'll tell you we've rescued them from addiction that are part of our program. Hundreds more people that can't be part of the program because we had to cap it at how many people we could give away stuff based on the donations that we get. But they don't get turned away. They get a muffin or a joint at the window every time. So we've proven that this works. We've got hundreds of people that will testify to that. We've got researchers, doctors, professors, literally hundreds of papers have now been written.
So when you say that it works,
and they're not even here to see.
You're saying that it helps manage withdrawal symptoms?
That's the main thing. That's the number one thing. It'll get people through withdrawal. Withdrawal is what keeps people addicted. They can't get through that withdrawal. They all want to quit. You ask any of these people, they'll go show them. But there's people that are down and out on the sidewalks. They all want to quit. They all wish there was treatment available that they could get into reasonably, or rehab, but the waiting list is huge. And even when they get the ability to be in it, many times they're too zoned out to actually make their appointments. They want to get off, but they can't. They can't get through the withdrawal. That's why they're jonesing so bad that they're willing to do anything to get what it takes to get that fix that'll stop that jones and that pain that's going on there. High dose edibles gets people through. They got to do it right.
Yeah.
You have to start low, go slow, but you find that right dose that works. The reason is because you can eat too much cannabis. Like, it's not pleasant at all.
Overdose, yeah.
Yeah, overdosing on...
I'd rather overdose on acid than I would.
Yeah, it won't kill you,
THC,
but it's very uncomfortable. People don't like it at all. That's our biggest problem, is people eat too much, they overdose on the edibles, they don't want to do it again. So we caution them all when they're just starting out, start low at a low dose, move up from there in 45-minute to an hour increments, and see where your dose is, and then use that. And we've had so many people be successful. Literally hundreds
Yeah,
of
and I
people.
just wanted to say that, like, one of my best friends, used to be a heroin addict, and injecting intravenously into the neck, and speedballs, and the whole nine. And yeah, it was definitely cannabis, smoking, a heavy, heavy, heavy amount all day, every day, that helped him get through those withdrawals.
Yeah, and the smoking is not the best way.
Yeah.
It doesn't usually work for most people. It's just not powerful enough. You really can't smoke too much cannabis, but you can eat too much cannabis. And because you can eat too much, you can find the right level and the right dose, and that's what works.
Yeah. And I wanted to say about him is that I was talking to him recently, and I was like, how do you feel about all this harm reduction thing? Because after getting clean, he was involved in the NA and the 12-step programs and all of this, and personally, a line has been crossed for me with the safe supply, because now there's a financial incentive for pharmaceutical companies to perpetuate the problem. So I asked him how he felt about that, and he's like, you want me to be honest with you? I think the government is using fentanyl to eliminate these dregs on society, these economic liabilities, human beings, But how do you feel about that?
I have no evidence to refute that. It doesn't appear to me like anybody really cares at the government level about any of these people that are dying, or dying in general. And they're not just dying here. These are the visible addicts. There's a whole bunch throughout society that are secret invisible addicts that got addicted because of doctors who were over-prescribing OxyContin and other opioids.
Yeah, and okay, so you were at that thing last night with Gabor Mate, and to me it's like there's a doctor on the stage, saying, presenting themselves as if they have the answer, when I don't see the harm being reduced by all these harm reduction. The drug war's getting worse. More people are dying. So how do you feel about harm reduction?
Well, we are harm reduction. That's what we're doing. We
Yeah.
reduce the harm, and in fact, we eliminate the harm if you're using cannabis. And although, like I say, you can eat too much edibles and not feel very good, so
Yeah.
I guess we're just reducing the harm that can happen with
Okay.
substances. But I mean, harm reduction is fine, but the goal should be getting the person off of those substances that aren't working well for them.
Yeah.
Well,
And
don't
give them
create a
full life.
harm reduction business like the government will propagate these things like, oh, we're reducing harm, and then actively create harm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well,
because it becomes a cycle. If they're getting tax dollars and making money to reduce the harm, then they want to keep having harm to reduce.
Well, then there's a
So
government bureaucracy as well. I mean, look at the big part of the drug war, the dirty wars in Central America was just after the fall of the Soviet Union, and they needed to justify, military budgets, and so they went and started a bunch of fucking wars.
It's terribly corrupt all the way through. There's never been any justification for it whatsoever. It's always been just a protection racket for corporate interests, basically. And the people are the ones that are suffering. It's becoming very, very clear just how deep the corruption is, how far it goes to the top. That because all we're asking for is reasonable access to what is just a plant that farmers could bring to market easily and cheaply if they were allowed to do so, but they're not because of state government restrictions. And this is a plant that helps people. It helps people get off opioids, but it helps people with those underlying issues that gets people using those drugs in the first place. Pain and insomnia and cancer and so many other issues that people suffer from. Cannabis is good in helping with all of those as well.
Yeah, I mean, to me, yeah, there's, I don't know, it boils down to housing a lot as well, because once you're, if you do want to get clean, then you need somewhere to be,
It costs our society a whole lot more to have all these homeless people than it would to house them. That's the sad part. That's the math on it. Having all these homeless people costs us a whole shit ton of money on emergency visits, on hospitalizations, on social workers, programs, and all the rest of it.
And
If we just housed these people in reasonable housing,
Yeah.
we would spend a lot less money, we would have a lot healthier population.
And then that's a part of me that suspects that there might be an economic incentive
Of course.
to end the lives of these people who are costing
Or to
so
keep
much money
feeding,
to
or to
the
keep
system.
feeding off them and not care about them.
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
yeah.
And when they die, that's just more power they have to say, well, we need to have our harm reduction model still get
So
funded
what
here,
message
so.
would you have for somebody like Gabor Mate, for instance, hero of the harm reduction movement, but the harm's not being reduced. What are they doing wrong?
For some people it is, but absolutely, all that's not right is there's not low barrier access to cannabis. There should be a cannabis shop on every block in this neighborhood that people can walk into, and without having to be ID'd, without having to have any money, they can access a high dose edible instead of having to, access something from one of the tents down here. For $5, they can get a hit of crack, meth, down, whatever they want. Easy to get. It's obviously easy to get because you've got thousands of people dying from this. So there are obviously a lot of people getting it throughout all levels of society. But you walk down Hastings Street and you'll be offered all kinds of stuff, upside down, everything, and it is upside down.
Benzos, and then now they're mixing, benzos with the fentanyl.
So naloxone doesn't work,
and it's getting into the northern communities as well, even in like northern Ontario, way far away from here. And that's part of the reason that some people suspect that, is the government doing this, that they're eliminating Indigenous people in northern communities.
So a lot of people that overdose don't die in this neighborhood because a lot of people have naloxone kits. So a lot of people are getting shot with naloxone. You mentioned benzene, which is now being mixed in, which now counteracts the naloxone. So now it takes 3 or 4 hits of naloxone to bring them back to life. But they are being saved by that. The DPD no longer carry naloxone kits because they had their budget cut. It doesn't cost much for a naloxone.
Okay, there you have it. There you have it. The government is killing people.
That's it. That's it. They're not allowing the police officers to carry naloxone because it's not in their budget.
Oh my.
And meanwhile, they have opiates that are available in vending machines, right?
Yeah, and they have all sorts of material and things available to people that they can use to use those opiates. They got pipes and other things. They're really continuing to perpetrate the problem here, and they're not allowing us. We are the solution, not for everybody, but we're the #1 harm reduction solution that there is to have high dose edibles available easy to people, and that's what's not being accepted. By this time, 5.5 years later, with all of those studies by all the people that support us and all the members that we have now, it's a no-brainer. They need to allow us to expand what we're doing here. But instead, Health Canada at this point says they're going to deny our application that we put in almost 2 years ago because all of our supply isn't legal according to them, and because they don't want to have high-dose edibles dispensed to people without a doctor's permission. In an area where full-grown consenting adults, usually started by a doctor, are on these drugs themselves, not now being supported by doctors, but easily available to them are all these other substances, and our substance is being suppressed when it really could solve the problem here. So there's no question that they're not trying to help anybody. Those reasons for them to deny our application are completely ludicrous. And the worst thing is they've never even come down to see us and talk to us about what we're doing. They have our application. We have communicated through Zoom and by phone, but where's the government representation? Where's Health Canada or the federal government to come and spend a day down here and just see what we're doing? Just see the reaction of the people that come and tell us, thank you so much for getting me off these drugs. Thank you so much. I got a good night's sleep last night. Oh my God, you guys are selling weed at $1 a gram. Now I can buy 5 grams of weed for $5, and I got weed left over in the morning when I wake up, and I still got some money in my pocket to buy food with. We hear that all day long because we have the $1 a gram. But $1 a gram is still $448 a pound. In a world where farmers bring to market all kinds of fruits and vegetables that are not as easy to produce as much of as cannabis is. Cannabis produces more biomass per cubic meter than any other crop a farmer would grow, and nobody in society is going to pay the farmers or the retailers more than $6.99 for any of the best fruits and vegetables that are out there, and we're paying at $1 a gram $448 for a pound of just cannabis.
Okay, so how can people support your work? How can people learn more about your work?
Check us out on Facebook, Cannabis Substitution Project, Vancouver. That's about it. Write letters to politicians, write letters to the government, talk to people, talk to media. This is very, very important. We are supposed to be in a free country. This is about access to a natural plant that for thousands of years was not criminalized, was used by hundreds of cultures for all sorts of great purposes. It was the basis of economies, for God's sake. And yet for the last 100 years, they've been trying to prohibit it here. And if they get away with their model of legalization, where we can't have, access as the marketplace would dictate and farmers would dictate, then we are not free people. It is one of the most, abundant examples of how we're not free. We're being criminalized for selling or growing this plant. We are not free people, and we need to be free.
So fuck legalization, fuck the law, and we are winning.
We will win.